Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We will continue with the scheduling of the event. So now we will hear an exciting lecture from a renowned historian and writer, Professor Paul Zeleza, and he'll tell us about the history of Pan-Africanism, which is such a fitting topic for this day and for TAIK in general. Without further ado, Professor Zeleza, if you have the floor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are on this special day, Africa Day, which also happens to be my birthday. I'm delighted to discuss with you a topic that is very important to peoples of African descent around the world, Pan-Africanism. In this case, what should be the Pan-Africanism of the 21st century? As a historian, I trust you'll understand, for me, this is an exercise in diagnosis into the pasts of Pan-Africanism, as it is a prognosis of its futures based on the dynamics of its multifaceted present. Let me begin with the obvious. Pan-Africanism is exceedingly difficult to define, periodize, and analyze because of its multiple referents as a constellation of ideas, movements, trajectories, and traditions. It embodies within its complex and contradictory ontological, epistemic, and ideological bosom postulations of philosophy, politics, and praxis, in which intellectuals, activists, and ordinary people have and continue to navigate the demands and desires of African humanity in the modern world. It is a world indelibly marked by the invidious and iniquitous histories of slavery, colonialism, capitalism, and globalization, as well as multidimensional, heroic, and humanistic struggles, aspirations, and achievements of African peoples in their diverse and intersected historical geographies, political economies, and cultural ecologies. In this brief presentation, I seek to map with the broadest of strokes the intellectual registers and ideological evolution of Pan-Africanism, its capaciousness and fluidity as a project among its protagonists, its manifold contemporary manifestations, and its possible futures in a rapidly and tumultuous world. Let me hasten to add, such is the plurality of Pan-African ideas and movements, and theory and praxis, that it makes sense to talk of Pan-Africanisms rather than a singular or encompassing Pan-Africanism. I look forward to a robust conversation on how we can, from our divergent social abodes, conceive and construct Pan-Africanisms for this exceedingly demanding, messy, and unpredictable century. So first of all, the intellectual and ideological trajectories of Pan-Africanism. What led to the development of Pan-Africanism as a set of ideas and movements, as intellectual and ideological projects? Definitions of Pan-Africanism are often filtered through enduring disciplinary and interdisciplinary paradigms and the social inscriptions of knowledge production, with their evident silences and slippages. Different scholars and practitioners stress specific aspects of Pan-Africanism, whether it's philosophical, political, economic, cultural, social, or artistic dimensions, all of which are critical for a holistic understanding. It is widely recognized that Pan-Africanism as a coherent body of thought first emerged in the historical crucible and struggles of the African Atlantic diasporas in the 18th century. It was an expression of racial solidarity engendered by the subjugation, denigration, and dehumanization of African peoples in the Euro-American world. Pan-Africanism emerged in the diaspora because the enslaved African peoples were systematically subjected to racialized oppression much earlier than their compatriots on the continent. Diaspora Africans were treated in a homogenized manner and came to see themselves as one people earlier than peoples on the continent, divided into different states and nations, and later colonial states and ethnic groups. Moreover, opportunities in the educational currencies of the emerging world system were more available in the diaspora than on the continent, which facilitated discursive insertion into the reigning discourses of nationalism, socialism, liberalism, and human rights, through which the various Pan-Africanisms were increasingly articulated. From the late 19th century, as the destructive avalanche of European imperialism descended upon continental Africa, Pan-Africanisms reflected simultaneously the experiences and struggles against enslavement and racial tyranny in the Americas and colonialism and its depredations in Africa. Thus, Pan-Africanism in its multidimensionality represented intertwined emancipatory, intellectual, ideological, political, economic, cultural, social, and artistic projects that called for the liberation and unification of African peoples in the diaspora and on the continent. Pan-Africanism affirmed the interconnectedness of the African condition in a world under Euro-American racial capitalism and hegemony. Consequently, the various evolving Pan-Africanisms embraced and ennobled the prevalent secular ideologies of liberalism, nationalism, socialism, Marxism, feminism, and internationalism, as well as the universalist religious influences of Christianity, Islam, traditional religions, and African-derived religions. As such, Pan-Africanism exhibits complex synthesis, an intricate melange of ideological and intellectual expressions of African humanity, racial redemption, modernity, and development. Pan-African thought and movements are interwoven by the belief that African peoples across the world share a common history and destiny, that their fates in the modern world are bound together, that they are irredeemably each other's keepers. Pan-Africanism is indeed a house of many mansions that contains within its composite edifice radical and conservative traditions, celebrations of African purity and parity, invocations of collectivist philosophies and elitist predispositions. It is simultaneously counter-hegemonic and often reinscribes prevalent epistemic hegemonies, as evident in the fact that studies of Pan-Africanism have been marked by gender and linguistic biases in the preponderance of male actors from the Anglo-centric world. The canonical works on Pan-Africanism often read as masculinist paeans to the intellectual and ideological and cultural work of the great men of African ancestry in the Anglophone world, along the triangular circuits of the Atlantic slave trade. It is encouraging that the number of publications that seek to overcome these shortfalls is growing. This includes most recently the voluminous Routledge Handbook of Pan-Africanism, published in 2020. The editor of the volume, Rayland Rabaka, forcefully reminds us, and I quote, "It would be virtually impossible to adequately grasp and grapple with Pan-Africanism without critically engaging the incomparable contributions of the National Association of Colored Women, the Universal African Black Cross Nurses, the Women's International Circle for Peace and Foreign Relations, the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, Fanny Barrier Williams, Margaret Mary Washington, Constance Cummings John, Ida Gibbs Hunt, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Amy Jack Garvey, Henrietta Vinton Davis, Claudia Jones, Jesse Fawcett, Addie Waite Hunton, Addie Dickerson, and Mary McLeod Bethune, among others," end of quote. The handbook offers a much needed inclusive historiography of Pan-Africanism in its 7 parts that focus on intellectual origins, historical evolution, and radical politics of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanist theories such as Black nationalism, Nkrumah's treatise on neo-colonialism, concepts of decolonization, Africanization, and Black consciousness. Pan-Africanism in the diaspora, encompassing the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, and Black women's Pan-African organizing. Pan-Africanism in Africa, that covers visions of Ethiopian internationalism, Pan-African movements in West Africa, Southern Africa, by women, social movements, queer Pan-Africanism, and the institutionalization of Pan-Africanism through the African Union. Literary Pan-Africanism in African, Caribbean, and American literatures by both men and women. Musical Pan-Africanism, from jazz to funk to Afrobeat to hip hop, and the contemporary relevance of Pan-Africanism for the 21st century. Given this amplitude, periodizing Pan-Africanism is quite challenging. Conventionally, three broad periods are identified. The period from the late 18th century to 1900, when ideas of Pan-Africanism germinated. The period between 1900 to 1958, which many regard as the high watermark of Pan-Africanism, and the contemporary period since African independence. Embedded in this periodization are constructions of Pan-Africanism as epistemic and organizational formations. Ali Mazroui's differentiation of Pan-Africanism into transatlantic, continental, and global articulations helps clarify the conceptual issues. Transatlantic Pan-Africanism flourished before the incomplete settlements of decolonization in Africa and the civil rights movement in the United States. It was characterized by the Pan-African Congresses of 1900 held in London, 1921 held in Paris, 1923 held in London, 1927 held in New York, and Manchester held in 1945, often associated with the leadership of W.B. Du Bois. There were also the conventions of the Universal Negro Improvement Association formed by Marcus Garvey. In the meantime, there was a wide range of radical Pan-Africanist organizations organized by trade union, women, and student activists in the Americas, Europe, and across Africa that simultaneously combined and maintained local, regional, national, transnational, and transcontinental liberation struggles and connections. Among the disciples of Du Bois and Garvey was Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who convened two crucial conferences in 1958, the Conference of Independent African States in April and the All-African Peoples Conference in December of that year, which marked the transition from transatlantic to continental Pan-Africanism. Continental Pan-Africanism eclipsed transatlantic Pan-Africanism as the newly independent African states became preoccupied with continental and regional integration. This achieved organizational preeminence with the establishment of the Organization of African Unity on May 25, 1963, the day we are celebrating today, in the venerated Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. The OAU was a compromise between the contending Casablanca bloc led by Nkrumah that wanted a federation of all African states, and the Monrovia group bloc led by Leopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal that preferred a more gradual and sub-regional approach to continental unity. The OAU, as we all know, was succeeded by the African Union in 2002. The two geopolitical Pan-Africanisms, transatlantic and continental, had their sub-regional variants. One could be called Black Atlantic Pan-Africanism, after Paul Gilroy's influential book, The Black Atlantic, which celebrates the unity of the diaspora, in which Africa is reduced to an innate presence of origin. For continental Africa, they are the Pan-Africanisms incubated in racist Eurocentric historical geography that divides the continent into sub-Saharan Africa and Arab Africa. Many Africans and international organizations, in their endless development reports, fervently believe in the imaginary separation of the sons of the Sahara and melanin, and talk like G.W.F. Hegel's ventriloquists of the real Africa as sub-Saharan Africa. For his part, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the revolutionary leader, sought to put Egypt at the center of what he regarded as the concentric circles of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, and Pan-Islamism. As I have long maintained in my scholarly and public intellectual work, Africa comprises the entire continent and its diasporas around the world. Towards global Pan-Africanism for the 21st century. Many Pan-African intellectuals and activists in the 20th century believed in global Pan-Africanism, even as they fought for the liberation of African peoples in their specific countries and societies. Social movements derive their power from both theory and praxis, and praxis in turn rides on the waves of entangled local and global histories. This is to argue that the prospects for global Pan-Africanism have improved considerably, but are also more fraught since the onset of the fourth phase of globalization. Time does not allow me to elaborate on the competing historiographies of globalization. Suffice to say, the three well-known typologies identify different phases and characteristics for the three previous globalizations. For John H. Hobson, the first phase occurred between 500 and 1450. For the World Economic Forum, it dates the first globalization between the 1st century BC to the 5th century and to the 13th and 14th centuries, while Jan Pieterse traces it back to 3000 BCE. They trace the second phase to 1450 to 1830, 15th to 18th century, and 1000 BCE respectively. Hobson dates the third phase to 1830 to 2000, while the World Economic Forum divides this phase into two, from the 19th century to 1914, and from 1945 to 1989. While Pieterse offers the longue durée, divided in two eras after 500 AD and 1000 AD. The fourth phase started, according to Johnson, from 2000, while the World Economic Forum, it can be divided into two eras, what it calls Globalization 3.0 from 1989 to 2008, and Globalization 4.0 of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, dominated by digital goods and services. For Pieterse, the fourth phase covers the era since 1500, broken into four periods: 1500, 1800, 20th century, and what he calls 21st century globalization. All three typologies seem to agree there is something distinctive about the globalization of the 21st century. The question for Pan-Africanists is, what does this mean for Pan-Africanism? How is this phase of globalization reconfiguring Pan-Africanism? How will Pan-Africanism be affected by the apparent ruptures of decoupling between the world's largest economies, the United States and China, and acceleration of the forces of deglobalization? This is a call for the reconstruction of Pan-Africanism that speaks to the immense challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Unfortunately, in this short presentation, I cannot provide satisfactory answers for these exceedingly difficult questions. However, you might be interested to know that they will inform one of my new book projects, titled The Long Transition to the 21st Century, A Global History of the Present, which seeks to examine the major features of the contemporary world, how they came about, and their differentiated manifestations in different world regions. It is divided into 5 parts. The first focuses on what I call the rise of the people, on social movements and struggles for emancipation and empowerment. The second, the emergence of planetary consciousness, on the development of global consciousness, fostered by the processes of globalization and growth of environmental awareness about the threat of climate change to our fragile planet. The third is called the digitalization of everything, on transformations brought about by the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the convergence of digital, biological, and physical systems. The fourth, the restructuring of the geopolitical order, on shifting global hegemonies, hierarchies, and struggles. And the fifth, the great demographic reshuffle, on changing demographic regimes and migration processes and patterns, including the exponential growth of the African population, which will by 2050 comprise 25% of the world total, and by the end of this century, 40% of the world's population. A revolution whose global implications have yet to be grasped by a world used to marginalizing the continent and its peoples scattered around the world. I would like to conclude that the Pan-Africanism of the 21st century must simultaneously look back and forward. The first requires critically examining the diverse and complicated histories of Pan-Africanisms in their ideological, political, economic, cultural, social, and artistic manifestations across the interconnected local national, regional, continental, transcontinental, and global historical geographies, paying attention to the work, struggles, activities, imaginations, and aspirations of elites and ordinary people, men and women, and young and old. Such an examination must elucidate the complexities, contradictions, and changes among the various Pan-Africanisms, as well as the sliding relations among African peoples on the continent and in the diaspora, along the poles of antagonism, ambivalence, adaptation, acceptance, and affirmation. The second entails locating Pan-Africanism in the maelstrom of the contemporary world and its pressing demands and tantalizing possibilities. How are increasing migrations from Africa transforming both the continent and the historic or legacy diaspora in terms of the flows of financial, philanthropic, human, and social capitals and imaginaries? What are the opportunities and dangers of the digital revolution in the flows of ideas, information, and images? In short, how is digital diasporization affecting the production and consumption of cultural commodities and services and the performance of identities in the Pan-African world? What do the political economies of the 21st century entail for African peoples around the world? What Wole Soyinka called proliferating imperialisms. How have their communities coped with the ravages of the Great Recession, the devastations of the COVID-19 pandemic, the disruptions of the war in Ukraine, the rising specter of deglobalization, the unfolding demands of the fourth industrial revolution, the calamities of climate change, and the rise of inequalities and populisms? How are their political, business, and civic leaders in national governments and parliaments, local, state, and municipal offices, institutions from educational establishments to religious organizations, and international and intergovernmental agencies doing to manage the multiple crises and seize the opportunities of the contemporary and unfolding world of the 21st century? The struggles of contemporary Pan-Africanism would be both familiar and new to earlier generations of Pan-African thinkers and activists. Former slavery and colonialism, which shackled hundreds of millions of Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, are gone, although many of their cruel and constraining legacies remain. The attainment of formal citizenship has not been translated into social emancipation, political empowerment, human dignity, and the inclusive promises of equity and integration for the vast masses of continental and diaspora Africans. And we have a lot to learn from our predecessors, their indomitable courage, extraordinary resilience, unflinching faith in their humanity and historic mission to liberate their own people and the world at large, to participate in the creation of a world civilization worthy of the human species on this exceptional, infinitely beautiful, but increasingly endangered planet. That is what I get reading more than 200 years of memoirs, narratives, biographies by the indefatigable Pan-Africanists of the past 2 centuries and more, and the numerous scholarly studies on them. I'm currently reading, or rather listening to audiobooks, an incomparable biography of Frederick Douglass by the historian David W. Wright, and the autobiography of Ida B. Wells. As I did after reading the autobiographies of Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela and many others, I'm filled with gratitude that they devote their entire lives to the freedom of their people in their own time and for the future. We have a responsibility to follow their hallowed footsteps, to follow their exceptional, extraordinary visions for Africans and the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a detailed and great lecture on Pan-Africanism. To our audience, if you have any questions for Professor Zeleza, please feel free to add that to a Q&A and I'll make sure to relay to him. I have one on my end that may be a bit generic, but working with TAIK so far, I've seen that, and being online a lot, I've seen that there are a lot of friction both on the color line, and you mentioned that a little bit, talking about North Africa versus not North Africa, and also friction across continents, so between Africans and Black Americans, for example. Can you tell us a bit about how can the youth, us trying to change things, how can we actually nurture Pan-Africanism in people? How can we do that? What are tools to go about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the first one is simply for Africans to not to apologize that they own the entire continent, that everybody who's on that continent is an African, and refuse to accept Eurocentric constructs that created this division between so-called Black Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa or Arab Africa. We have to understand the context in which that was created. It was in a context of rising imperialism and racism in the Western world, in which thinkers of that period were determined to prove the inferiority, cognitive, just congenital inferiority of enslaved Africans in the Americas. They had to justify slavery. And people like Hegel in Germany, famous German philosophers we all know, said that, Africa below the Sahara is a land of childhood. That's where the real Africa should be located. The northern part is not part of Africa. It's part of Europe. And we have in the 19th century, 20th century, the creation of historical geographies in which we even talk about the Middle East, Middle from whom Peter Abrahams, the famous South African novelist, used to ask. It was, of course, Middle for the British, from India. So we have to understand the intellectual constructs behind the conceptions that we take for granted today. And last week, I was at a conference at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And one of the really powerful points that was made by some of the officials is that even the production of data on Africa by international organizations, the World Bank, IMF, you name it, tends to, when they talk about Africa, they're really talking about Sub-Saharan, and the data is confined to that. And then when they talk about North Africa, they include it in MENA, Middle East and North Africa. That does not serve the continent, which has its own institutions, like the UN Commission for Economic, Economic Commission for Africa, African Development Bank, and even African sports that are continental. So the first thing, let's embrace the continent and refuse to be defined by Eurocentric scholarship. Secondly, and the most powerful tool in constructing and getting to know each other, not only within the continent, but also from the continent to the diaspora, in the diaspora, is really education. It is very troubling that in much of what we know about each other, what Africans know about African Americans, for example, or Afro-Brazilians, or Black French, or whatever, is really filtered through the media. And it's not something that we develop by a systematic education and understanding and engagement with the histories, the struggles, the achievements of our people in the diaspora. And the same is true that besides slavery and romantic notions of African empires from time to time, very little is actually taught in schools out here about African history in all its complexities and contradictions. And therefore, people also here, when they meet with people from the continent, their perceptions are filtered through stereotypes that have been constructed by the media. And both sides need to shed these stereotypes by engaging in systematic education and understanding of each other that is informed by our complex, separate, and of course, interconnected histories.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I really liked what you said about us owning the continent and refusing to be defined by Eurocentric media. And I have one question here from the audience, from TK, who's one of who's a TAIK as well. She says, "What are some continuing tropes that we have held on to about what it means to be African?" She's referring to Africans holding on to misconceptions about who and what we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could define that in 2 words, is the notion of less than. It's a very powerful ontological and cognitive conceptual epistemic sort of approach. Whatever we are analyzing, if you look at it very carefully, it's always depicted as less than. So when we are talking about African history, it's less than. African, economies is less than. African humanity is less than. African achievements, less than. We are always comparing ourselves on this sliding scale of less than. And it goes, into even our own behaviors, sexualities, almost everything is always on this register of less than. And Europe held the pedestal, and we seeing ourselves as becoming Europe, acquiring Europeanness, acquiring the attributes of whiteness. And this has very dangerous implications, as we all know. Let me just give a few examples. So in African countries today, I'm sure many of you will know this, parents take enormous pride, middle-class parents, and certainly elite parents, enormous pride in the fact that their kids don't speak the local language. That's madness. I don't think any German takes pride, or any American takes pride, or any Chinese or Japanese takes pride in their kids not knowing their language. And as Al-Mazrui told us, no civilization has ever developed on the basis of other people's languages. So that distancing from the collective self of Africa in terms of language, you also see it in terms of even standards of beauty. One of the biggest markets for skin bleaching creams is the former colonial territories of India and certainly Africa and the Caribbean. And again, it's that aspiration to whiteness. It's engendered by that sense of less than, of trying to become the other, the valorized white. And you also find this in sort of almost everything when we're doing it. It makes me laugh and also very sad that African governments and even businesses would rather get consultants from Europe when in fact you have tons of your own educated people who can do that. And even sometimes our artists, if they thrive abroad, in Paris, in London, in New York, we give them special accolades because they've been recognized in the belly of the imperial beast that has taught us for generations we are less than. So it's really this notion of less than. And we have to strive against it in every realm of our social existence, in our thinking about ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you so much for what you said was sad, but also so true about us not trying to reach for, Europeanness when we have so much for ourselves already. I have one question from a fellow TAIK, Brian. He's asking, what are your thoughts on having a unified Africa, not just in social dynamics and economic collaboration, but also as a unified political bloc? After all, the present day boundaries were drawn up not by Africans, but by Western powers.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, this is an old debate. As I sort of briefly referred to, people like Kwame Nkrumah were convinced Africa must unite. He wrote that book in the early 60s, and of course, many other works. And they understood precisely that, as you just noted, that Africa is balkanized. Africans were not sitting in Europe, during the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 and other negotiations of boundaries to say, okay, these are our ancient civilizations, ancient nation states. So can you draw the boundaries along that? Of course not. And the boundaries in a good number of boundaries are straight lines cutting, as we all know. People who had been, Mazrui put it absolutely brilliantly. He said, colonialism brought people together who had been separate and separated people who had been together in terms of prior constellations of historical formations. So it is absolutely true. We are not, we didn't draw these boundaries. And it's also true that this balkanization of Africa weakens the continent as a whole. So just to give you a couple of examples, when the European Union is negotiating with African countries, the various arrangements, including the EPAs, it's negotiating with individual countries, whose GDP is typically smaller than one of their major cities. And therefore, your negotiating power is very weak. China, which is now Africa's biggest trading partner, it has been since 2009, is one huge country of 1.2 billion people, 1.3 billion people, and the second largest GDP in the world in terms of nominal GDP. In PPP, it is the largest. And it's negotiating with 55 different countries. There's no way you can have the kinds of negotiations that will serve your interest. So yes, it's absolutely essential that there be mechanisms for the unification of Africa. Having said that, we also know that political socialization and political culture develops even if you did not create that reality. So today, I would argue, ironically, people are both more African on the continent and less African than previous generations. So bear with me. They are more African because the circuits of communication of Africanness, from sports to television to music to all these big conferences, social movements, women's movement, environmental movements, is much better organized than it used to be because of technologies that enable that, forces of globalization, and so on and so forth. But also, people are less African in the sense that they are more national than they used to be in the old days, in this sense. Again, just a couple of examples. If you were in East Africa in the 1950s and you wanted to go to university, there was only one university called Makerere. If you were in, French West Africa, it was, the University of Dakar, now Sheikh Anta Diop. So what it meant was that the elites of French West Africa, the elites of East Africa actually went to the same schools, certainly university, if the ones who went to local universities. So they had a pan-East African, a pan-West African, and a pan-African mindset that was far stronger than many of us trained and maybe resided our entire lives in our own countries. I've never been to another country. So it's a very contradictory process that we are looking at. And also, more importantly, the countries that have emerged from colonialism have developed identities, powerful identities in terms of statecraft and state power. And even if you rule a little banana something, you're still president. And the opportunity, the possibility of the ruling political classes in Africa surrendering meaningful power to regional and supra-regional entities called the African Union or ECOWAS or the East African Community or SADC, Southern African Development Community, you name it, is quite limited. It's interesting that the African Free Trade Area, Continental Free Trade Area that became operational last January, is really, basically has shelved its progress in the sense that, it wants to make sure that we trade more among each other because, now we have the lowest intra-regional trade in the world. Only 15% of Africa's, world trade is internal. And something has to be done, and that is going to do something. But what is also interesting with that agenda is that it has put the back burner any talk which erupted for a brief period in the early 2010s about political union. So there are all these complicated forces, but we should all support efforts for greater regional integration, for greater continental integration. And because integration was one of the key 5 humanistic and historic agendas of Pan-Africanism, of African nationalism: decolonization, nation building, development, democracy, and regional integration. All these are works in progress, even decolonization. So the role of each generation of Africans is to continue the race towards greater engagement, coordination, collaboration, partnerships within cooperation within the continent.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. We have another question from the audience. This is an anonymous attendee asking, how can we solve the issue of having fellow Africans corrupt with money or whatever that are obstacles in our battles? For example, Blaise Compaoré. It's a controversial one.
Yes, thank you. I think the issue of corruption is a very serious issue. Corruption is simply an immoral and unconscionable taxation on society. So resources that could have been deployed, that could have been used, that could have been mobilized for national development are going into the pockets of individuals, usually wasted and invested in foreign banks. We all know the amount of leakage from the African continent on an annual basis is huge. At the ECA conference that I mentioned, which was in Dakar last week, it gave figures that really boggle your mind. The export, the illicit flows from the continent, they run into tens of billions of dollars. So the issue is multiple. A, what are the structures and what are the mindsets, the legal regimes, the attitudes towards corruption in our societies that could contain, that could constrain corruption? And if you have laws, to what extent are they implemented seriously? Now, in many cases, we find that no government will tell you that we are corrupt. They'll always claim they're clean, and they will even have laws against corruption. The challenge is always between the proclamation, the policy, and the execution. And the terrain of execution of any policy, just like the making of policy, but certainly the implementation of policy, is a responsibility of the entire society. In other words, to what extent do our societies condone or fight against corruption, both overtly or covertly, explicitly or implicitly? How many of us are reluctant to bribe the policeman on the road because of a broken light, or we didn't renew our license, or because we want to get a service quickly? In other words, as societies, we have developed certain immoralities in how to conduct business, in how to get things done that oil the machinery of corruption at every level. So this is not simply a legal question or a political question or a structural question. It is also a question of morality, public morality, a question of mindsets, a question of collective integrity, and raising the cost through our institutions on corruption that, as I said, is a tax on development. At the UN conference, Economic Commission conference last week, I was talking about what leads to development as compared to stagnation or underdevelopment. Of course, there are many forces, but one factor is quality of institutions. Your judicial institutions, education institutions, property institutions, you name it. And it's also the quality of human capital and the quality of social trust. And we need to make sure at every level, those of us who are serious about corruption, it's easy to point out to the leaders, and we should, because they set a bad example, and their capacity to steal a lot of money to destroy their countries is greater than the person paying the bribe on the roadside. However, even at the roadside, to what extent are we going to refuse a culture of corruption? The second aspect of this is the external dynamic, in which the entire international financial system for the last several centuries has been created in a way that it perpetually siphons, both legally, in terms of laws formed by that very system, and illegally, siphon resources from Africa and the global south. One of my areas of work is economic history. The drainage of surpluses from Africa started with the slave trade. This was hitting at the very heart of production by draining the continent of its human capital. Africa did not recover its share of the world population that it had as the slave trade was gathering momentum in 1750 until the early 2000s. It took us 250 years to recover demographically. And this was followed by the drainage of our raw materials in terms of unequal exchange, a continuous deterioration of terms of trade for primary products in the world economy. That's been going on for a very long time. Samir Amin, the great Egyptian political economist, has written, he passed away a few years ago, written volumes on this issue of unequal exchange. It's been going on for a long time. And then you come, fast forward to the contemporary period. What is the structure of our economies? We're still dependent largely on export of raw materials. In fact, manufacturing has declined. It used to be 21% in the 1970s. By 2012, it was 7%. So we talk of Africa rising. It's really about selling more commodities and the hunger for commodities that was there in China. The structure of our economies has not shifted, and therefore the mechanism that reproduces external pillage through an equal exchange continues. And then, of course, you have the obviously flagrant illicit flows. Where is that money being kept? It's not kept, definitely not under their mattresses in their houses. Some do. It's not being kept in African banks. Some do. The offshore ones. It's mostly kept in European and American banks. And there is a vast industry of lawyers, financial institutions. We have heard about this through the Panama Papers, the recent revelations that came out of all these, tax havens and so on and so forth. Who controls those spaces? They're in London, they're in New York, they're in Germany, they're in France. So one of the things we have to fight for is really the change in the international financial system, creating structures and mechanisms that lead to a fairer distribution of wealth globally. And most importantly, that stop this centuries-old leakage, drainage, export of our hard-earned resources.
Such a powerful way of ending this lecture. Let us all keep everything you said in mind. Thank you again for giving us your time and answering our questions and all the inspiring thoughts you've shared with us. Thank you. To our audience, we will meet again in 15 minutes. Right now, we'll have a 15-minute long music break. So enjoy the music. And we will come back with a inspired interview of Professor Alem Seged by fellow TAIK K-Lab. And after that, we'll have Mustafa Mbaki, another TAIK, deliver the closing remarks before we announce the TAIK 54 most impactful organizations. So see you again soon. Thanks, Professor.
And thanks, Aji. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.